House Bill 245, School Funding, Required Local Contribution, by Representative Tammie Wilson. Please introduce yourself and you may begin.
Thank you, Madam Chair. For the record, my name is Representative Tammie Wilson, District 2. Thank you for the extra few seconds to run back upstairs to get the information I thought I had. House Bill 245 is an act repealing the required local contribution to school funding, making conforming changes and providing the date to that. This looks like a really long bill, but it's really a very simple bill. And I probably should have said that at this point. The state of Alaska has a duty under Article 6, Section 1 of the Constitution of the state of Alaska to establish and maintain a system of public schools open to all children of the state. The fiscal burden placed on local governments that must bear the burden is enormous and consuming. The state of Alaska provides only partial funding to organized boroughs, home rule cities in the unorganized borough, and first-class cities and unorganized boroughs to carry out the state's responsibility for education by deducting a local contribution of 2.6 mils from the level of state aid as stated in 14.17.410 G2. In the area of Alaska outside organized boroughs, home city, rural cities in the unorganized boroughs, home rule cities and first-class cities in the unorganized boroughs, the state carries out its duty for education through state educational service areas established under AS 1408-031, which exempt them from the required local contribution. There are presently 19 state education service areas. There's also an inequity that our bill doesn't take care of, and that is impact aid, where some of these, even though they do not pay local contribution, impact aid is taken off of what the state constitution says that the state should be responsible for. So there are actually two issues, but ours is only talking about local contribution of the 2.6 mils. In 1963, Alaska State Legislature passed and Governor Egan signed into law the Mandatory Borough Act, dictating that certain regions of Alaska, those encompassing Ketchikan, Juneau, Sitka, Kodiak Island, Kenai Peninsula, Anchorage, and Matanuska, Susitna Valleys, and Fairbanks to form organized boroughs by January 1st, 1964. And just to remind those, Fairbanks had a vote, and they voted against a borough, but this is the act that made them a borough. Furthermore, Section 1 of the Mandatory Borough Act promised that no area incorporated as an organized borough shall be deprived of state services, revenues, or assistance, or be otherwise penalized because of incorporation. And basically, if you want to have parks, if you want to have fire service, if you want to have more police, that's what the borough was supposed to, or cities, to pay for. It was never the intent that we would end up having to pay for things that the state would have paid for instead. So HB 245 removes the required local contribution penalty imposed by the state of Alaska on organized areas and again fulfills its constitutional responsibility. And with your indulgence, Madam Chair, I just wanted to give just a brief history of how this came about, because you may think that this has always been that way, but it hasn't been. So in the first foundation formula, basic need, which is a different formula, not specifically the one, they took off half of federal impact aid and then took off 3.5 mils for the state allocation to each district. In 1969, North Slope oil leases were signed. So you can imagine that windfall surpluses begins flowing into the state, pressure bills from organized cities and boroughs for greater state assistance, and the legislature again begins debate on amending the foundation formula. And the second foundation formula, state support starts out at 90% of basic need, and throughout the 70s slowly increases to 100%. So this is when the state did take their responsibility on, and they paid both portions of this. Oil price crashes. Local contribution is again debated. In 1986, oil prices crashed to $9 a barrel, and the state panics. And the state's very good when they panic to what? Take the responsibility and give it to our local municipalities. State needs as much money as possible, and a new formula for education funding is proposed. In 1988, local contribution is back and at 4 mils at that point. SB 182, 2012, in order to put all organized districts back to an equal playing field, the required local contribution was reduced to 2.65 mils and is based on the full and true value of property. And making it equal is because some areas were giving much more to education than others were when we were talking about the 4 mils. So they tried to make it better by making it 2.65. So what does this mean to you? And most of you pay local contribution, but you pay within your property taxes. Does that mean that boroughs would no longer give to education? No, right now, we do mandate part of that, 2.65, but many boroughs and cities give over that amount. And a lot of them don't go up to the cap at this point. So this would allow them to go up to the cap and also have money left over to go back to citizens who pay property taxes or possibly lower their sales tax depending upon how they do it. But it is my feeling, and looking at the Constitution, that the state should fulfill the basic needs formula. They made the formula. And to look at the boroughs and the cities who became organized and took on more responsibility to have to pay this. And if you look at your fiscal note, you'll see a $206 million fiscal note. That's the impact that we are having on our boroughs and cities. With that, Madam Chair, I have Dan Bockhurst on the line from Ketchikan, who has been very instrumental in this legislation, that has more information or questions.
Thank you. Do we have any questions before we move on? I'd like to recognize Representative Sadler's joined us.
Madam Chair.
Representative Seaton.
Thank you. You said you were addressing only the property tax and not the impact aid. So does that mean that under this bill, the 50% would still be subtracted from the rural education attendance areas, and so they would be paying then in greater proportion local contribution, and yet the municipalities would have no requirement to have a local contribution?
Representative Seaton, through the chair, no, that is incorrect. The part that is correct is right now the impact aid would still be subtracted off. It's 100% that's subtracted right now for the rural education areas. That would be the same for all the municipalities. So if Fairbanks has impact aid, that would continue to be taken off of what the state would give them. So it would not make it uneven. What would still be unequal is that some give more than others. And you should find in your packet, it's the Alaska Department of Education, the foundation, and it will show in column D all the eligible federal impact aid, and then in E it has the percent, and as you'll see, some of them are under 100%. If this bill were to pass, they would all be 100%. So Fairbanks, although it shows on here that they give $26,940,000, they would not have all that returned to them because their impact aid, it would increase on how much would be taken off. And if you look down, I think there's only one, there's very few that don't receive federal impact aid, very few communities.
And Madam Chair and Representative Wilson, the question of the additional funding is limited to 23%. So if we're subtracting the full amount of tax, a local property tax that does go to schools, and then you can contribute 23% above, now you would be limited to that 23% above, so that my understanding is almost all districts are doing something above, and now that 23% would not represent even the equivalent of the amount of tax. So there would be a reduction in the amount of money that every school district almost that sit within a municipality that the local residents could give to education. Is that correct?
Representative, through the chair, that is not my understanding. My understanding, the cap would still hold, and so they couldn't give the same amount they're doing because it would put them over the cap, but they would be able to give what they are over the required amount. All this would do would be basically backfilling that portion that the state, by Constitution, should be doing.
Representative Seaton.
Yeah, Madam Chair, almost all districts are doing something above their required local contribution.
Correct.
Eating into that 23%. If the required local contribution, which is greater than the 23%, is taken away and only the 23% is available, it means that the ability of local residents to contribute to their schools is reduced. Is that not correct?
Representative, through the chair, when I went through this with legal, I used Fairbanks as an example, and Fairbanks gives approximately $48 million to education. They are only required to give $26 million. The 48 isn't to the cap. They have approximately $13 million more that they could give to schools. If this were to pass, of that $26 million, which of course will decrease a little bit because their impact aid they wouldn't get as much credit for, so let's say it's about $20 million, they would be able to give 13 of that 20 to go up to the cap amount. The additional $7 million that's left over, I would hope they would give it back to taxpayers, but they could do other things that the municipality needs. So they would still be able to go to the cap of it, and probably more would be able to afford it. Now, let's say it's Wrangell instead. Wrangell already goes up to the cap. There is nothing left to fill. That difference for them would go back to the taxpayers or to something that the borough wanted to do outside of the schools. So from my understanding, this would actually allow more funding to go into those schools who are not currently paying as much in as they could.
Representative Seaton.
Well, thank you. The Fairbanks example is a good one because I think what you said was the local people would lose the ability for $7 million, which is currently going into their schools. They could not do that because that would be over the cap. There's $26 million, $48 million gives them half of that they can do, but then they reach the cap.
Representative Seaton, through the chair, no, that's not correct. What it is right now is that what you're not counting in, when you're saying $7 million goes back, is now that $26 million is being paid by the state. So the state would be giving in the 26 that we're giving as Fairbanks, because that's the local contribution that we are now giving as our 2.6 mills. So that's the first part, is the 2.6 mills would be fulfilled by the state, which is the $26 million if this were to pass. That $26 million is the amount of money that we're using now. They still get the $26 million, it's just by the state instead of the borough. And then when we're talking about the additional $13 million they would be able to put in schools, that is the $13 million out of that 26 that they would be able to give in addition to what they're giving now, because the state has fulfilled their mandate. So no, schools get more. The only schools that don't get more are schools that currently are paying up to the cap, but they don't lose money either, because it would be the same amount. The community would get the savings. But for those communities, I think Anchorage is one that's not up to the cap at this point. Matsu isn't. I think there's only a couple that have actually gone up to the cap. They would all be able to, it would be a choice of the community, so it's not a mandate. It would be up to the community what they wanted to do, but it would give the districts more money without coming out of taxpayers, because we're already giving it.
Okay, and I think that what I'd like to do is move on to Dan Bockhurst, who may have a different way of explaining, and we may get a little bit more out. No offense, Representative Wilson.
No offense taken.
Mr. Bockhurst, are you online with us?
I am, Madam Chairman.
Great, and I'm sure you've heard some of the discussion, and sometimes just having a different person say it connects. So if you can introduce yourself for the record, and you may begin.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. For the record, my name is Dan Bockhurst. I'm the manager of the Ketchikan Gateway Borough. Thank you for the opportunity to testify. First of all, I'd like to commend Representative Tammie Wilson for her understanding of the bill. She explained it to you very well, and she responded to the questions from Representative Seaton very well. I have submitted 10 pages of written testimony for the record through Representative Tammie Wilson with additional materials, so I plan to keep my remarks this morning brief. Every good law should have at least 3 characteristics. It should be fair, it should reflect sound public policy, and of course it must be constitutional. The law imposing the required local contribution fails on every one of those 3 points. For that reason, the Ketchikan Gateway Borough strongly supports House Bill 245 that repeals the required local contribution. I'd like to explain. First, the required local contribution is far from fair. It creates 2 very distinct classes of citizens in Alaska. Those in 34 municipal governments of the 163 municipal governments in Alaska, who are required by state law to operate school districts, and those in the remainder of the state comprising 19 other school districts in Alaska. The required local contribution imposes a crushing fiscal burden on the 34 municipal governments, shifting to them approximately 20% of the state's constitutional duty to adequately fund schools in those municipal districts. At the same time, the state exempts from the required local contribution those other 19 districts. It's important to understand that there is simply no rational basis for the disparate treatment between the two classes established by the required local contribution. Some of the most economically distressed areas of Alaska are among the 34 municipalities that are subject to the required local contribution, while some of the more prosperous regions of Alaska are among the 19 districts that enjoy exemption from the required local contribution. As Representative Wilson indicated, the required local contribution also fails the fairness test in that it breaches a critical promise to the citizens of Alaska expressed in the 1963 Mandatory Borough Act that boroughs will not be deprived of state revenues or otherwise penalized because of incorporation. The second prong, the required local contribution, fails the sound public policy test. The required local contribution is a grinding public policy that punishes organized boroughs, the foundation of local government in Alaska. The framers of our Constitution intended that the state would create inducements for boroughs. In fact, the Alaska Supreme Court has held that our Constitution encourages the formation of boroughs. In reality, Jay Hammond, former state representative, former state senator, and former governor, offered a far different perspective when he wrote, attractive enough on paper, in practice, the organized borough concept had little appeal to most communities. After all, why should they tax themselves for services received from the state gratis? Governor Hammond clearly told it like it is. I'd like to offer just 6 facts demonstrating how difficult the circumstances have become. Today, we stand 55 years after statehood, and much more than half of Alaska remains outside organized boroughs despite our constitutional encouragement of the creation of boroughs. Very few Alaskans have freely chosen to incorporate. Consider that residents of organized boroughs today, 95% of those are residents who live in the 8 mandatory boroughs. This fact alone makes it compelling to honor the 1963 promise that Representative Tammie Wilson spoke about, established in state law for equal and fair treatment of boroughs. House Bill 245 would do much to restore the luster to that promise. Today, 55 years after statehood, those who have freely chosen to form boroughs are outnumbered by those who have freely chosen not to be in a borough by more than 2 to 1. An example of how ineffective our policy of encouraging boroughs is was evident 7 years ago when voters in one region of Alaska, with resources described by the State Attorney General's office as the envy of most organized boroughs, rejected incorporation by a margin of more than 9 to 1. Over 90% of the voters that voted on the question rejected borough formation. Also telling is that having written, sponsored, and successfully shepherded into law the 1963 Mandatory Borough Act, former Representative John Rader repudiated the Mandatory Borough Act years later. He regretted having played the fundamental role in getting that law into place. Today, state officials speak in terms of the, quote, misery of boroughs, unquote, rather than the vision of those who wrote our Constitution. To me, these circumstances are the canary in the coal mine, telling you that the required local contribution is terrible public policy that weighs heavily on students, taxpayers, and others in organized boroughs. The third prong, the required local contribution, is unconstitutional. The Ketchikan Gateway Borough has engaged in extensive study and evaluation involving a number of attorneys over the last 6 years, and we've attempted amicable ways of addressing our concerns, which have not been successful. So after 6 years of effort, the Ketchikan Gateway Borough last month filed suit over the unconstitutional aspects of the required local contribution. The law setting out the required local contribution dedicates public funds to a particular purpose, thereby violating Article 9, Section 7 of our Constitution, the anti-dedication clause. The required contribution also operates in a manner such that the dedicated funds are never subject to legislative appropriation, which violates Article 9, Section 13 of our Constitution. Further, the required local contribution law circumvents the governor's veto authority in Article 2, Section 15. In conclusion, again, the required local contribution is not fair, it's poor public policy, and it's clearly unconstitutional. On behalf of the Ketchikan Gateway Borough, I therefore urge the passage of House Bill 245. That concludes my comments. If there are questions, I'll be happy to try to address them.
Thank you, Mr. Bockhurst. Any questions? Representative Drummond was in the queue. I'm not sure if she was
Oh, I was just commenting if the, thank you, Madam Chair. It looks like Anchorage is pretty close to the cap. If the cap is the distance between the total budgeted education funding and the supplemental funding capacity in column F. Anchorage has not been that close to the cap in the past, but I see it's pretty close now. And in addition, where's all this additional money going to come from the state? We're already in severe budget deficits, and you're talking about several $100 million in additional funding to keep schools whole.
Representative Drummond, through the chair, that's for finance to keep going through and finding those. Because the state is going into deficit, why should the municipalities have to pick that up? And that's what we're doing. The other choice could be, as a policy, is to look at all the districts. There used to be, from my understanding, a head tax for education where everybody who had a check, it wasn't by per person, came out of their check at the beginning of the month. You know, this is a constitutional issue first. It is that the state is responsible for setting, well, policymakers set the basic needs. The state should be filling that obligation. Again, if we're going to go by funding, let's continue to look at that. If we're going to be going into deficit, and we know that it's going down, at some point, are we going to look at increasing that and making that 4 mills, 5 mills, 6 mills, to where local areas who have organized areas are going to foot the entire bill? Because that has been the way that the state has acted in the past. When they run out of funds, they look at the municipalities. And one further thing on that, Madam Chair, I attended the Nenana Borough. They're looking into becoming a borough. And the first thing, one of the people who were doing the presentation said, you have to give 2.6 mills as a borough and take over your schools as far as buildings, maintenance, almost all that. So we're not talking about just the foundation that our municipalities have. It's that whole portion of it. The first thing that you heard coming out of people's mouths were, why would we want to give 2.6 mills for something at this point that the state is taking care of? So before we even get the discussion of becoming organized and maybe taking on other responsibilities so they have more police service, fire service, some of those health and safety portions of it, what we look at it instead is, how much are we going to go in deficit as a municipality because the state decided we could pay instead of them? And that really is the issue at this point. Constitutional, what do you believe? Is it the responsibility of the state to fulfill this mandate, or is it only the responsibility of the state when they have funds?
Thank you. Representative Ledoux.
I'm just sort of curious I served in municipal government. I was the mayor of the Kodiak Island Borough. And we always talked about how unfair it was that the REEs didn't have to pay anything. And we talked about maybe there should be a mandatory borough for those folks. We never talked about, maybe this whole thing was unconstitutional. As a borough official, I probably would be head over heels in love with this bill. I'm just not sure at the moment what the impact it would have on the state budget. But you know, looking over, I read that whole thing that Mr. Hicks wrote. There's probably a decent chance that whether the state wants to do this or not, that this Ketchikan lawsuit may prevail, and we may have no choice but to do it.
Quickly, on through Chair Representative Ledoux, I want to make sure to point out that there is impact aid into a lot of these. So to say that the REAAs don't pay anything into it, they do. What's very interesting, if you look down, for instance, Kenai Peninsula, they don't pay any, you know, there's no federal impact aid coming in there, so the $22,690,000 required right now would come back to them and not having taken off. But again, you know, we're using different kinds of formulas, and there are other ways too that if you want to make it to where everybody in the state is given equally, you do have that option. I find it interesting, two things, you know, both, that's twice now we heard, well, how can the state afford it? You know, when the Constitution was made, it wasn't could the state afford it, what is the state's responsibility? And I really, you know, want to stay back on the Constitution that because this bill is not about mandatory boroughs. I am not advocating that everybody become a borough. What I want to do is make it to where we take one of the major penalties away from becoming one, so that when one looks at it, they're looking at the services that they can give additionally to their constituents versus starting in the hole from day one.
I'm just sort of
Follow-up,
I'm just sort of
Representative Ledoux.
curious. Are there other states in which the state has a constitutional mandate to fund public education, which have charged their boroughs or whatever, their counties, with paying a portion of it? Are there any similar suits going on in other areas right now?
Through Chair Representative Ledoux, not that I'm aware of. In fact, we are one of the few, if not only state, that the state actually pays more than the local municipalities. Most of the counties, it is literally on the local level, and they pay a lot of it. Not all the states, but but most states, the local groups use their taxpayer money, and then the state supplements that portion of it, where ours is almost kind of in reverse. But as far as I know, there's no lawsuits like this. There's nobody who has it in their Constitution in which another group feels is unfair. They may think taxing's unfair, but I think that's just a human thing.
Representative Peggy Wilson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Has anyone really defined what basic education needs are? I mean, is that reading, writing, arithmetic? I mean, you know, is it possible that this would backfire and we'd find out that the state's responsibility is to do certain things, and the rest, if the schools want to add those things on, they can?
Representative Wilson, through the chair, you, the legislature, has determined what basic needs is. How you did that, I couldn't speak to. But the formula has been determined as basic needs. It's gone through some court cases as far as, are we funding schools adequately? Are we doing the oversight? And one of the most recent court cases said that, yes, we are adequately funding education. Our oversight was not so good, and we had a judgment on that portion of it. So just by having that statute on the formula, that's how we have determined basic need. Now it comes down to who's responsible for fulfilling it, and then you get into some federal law, and that's what Representative Seaton was referring to as far as how that cap was determined to make sure that we're equitable throughout the state.
Thank you. Representative Reinbold.
Okay. I just have a quick question. In regards to the Anchorage contribution, it says 97 million, I believe it is, for fiscal year 2015. When I looked at the comprehensive annual financial report from the Anchorage School District, it actually showed that we gave $248 million for local contribution to education. So I guess what I'm wondering, that's one question. Is it just because that's just the required and they can give more than that? And maybe you're not the right person to ask, because I'm looking at your face right now. And then also I wanted to ask a question.
And if you could ask just one at a time so we
Okay.
can kind of all stay together, please.
Through the Chair, Representative Reinbold, the 98 million you're talking about, that's the required contribution. The other amount, not that I'm looking at the same thing, most likely is what they can give to almost up to the cap. You'll see on Fairbanks, it shows 26 million approximately, we give $48 million. So there is a difference between the amount that goes in and replaces state aid to total contribution by a municipality.
Okay.
Representative Seaton.
Thank you. And your comment on building schools was also interesting. So is the idea that if this passes and the state will be required for building schools and there won't be the 70-30 bond or 60-40 local contribution with the boroughs owning the schools, that would be like the REAs, where the state is going to be responsible for building the schools as well?
Through the chair, Representative Seaton, when I was talking about buildings, it was referring to the Nenana Borough. If they became a borough, they would then be responsible for all the schools, which currently come underneath the state. No, that this bill would have no impact on the bonding. It would have no impact on the capital projects that come through or the maintenance portion of that. All this would do would take the state and have them pay in based on their formula. All the rest that is currently being done by the municipalities would continue to be done. This is just talking about the basic needs formula.
And
Please, go ahead.
one more. Representative Wilson was getting at one of the things that Representative Peggy Wilson was trying to get at this, that one of the questions that I've had is that we were found in a court case to be adequately funding education. There was nothing that said that if we had funded less or if we hadn't had our contributions for that we've added for career and technical education and those things, if we didn't have those components in there, that it still wouldn't be adequate. And I think that that's what she was saying, is an adequate education and basic need could be reading, writing, math, those things could be considered inadequate education, in which case there wouldn't be a requirement for the state to backfill money. And so the question becomes, is what happens when the schools are limited? Like the Kenai Peninsula Borough has historically been funding at the cap. I have no confidence at all that the state is going to backfill $200 million in the future, all these future years, by saying that basic need includes all these pieces that we've added on to education to provide really good education and career and technical education, and all of those aren't required as far as a basic educational need. So limiting the ability of the taxpayers of a borough because they're limited to the 23% of the cap. And if the state doesn't backfill to what is considered basic need, because $200 million a year just to maintain where we are, I don't think we're going to do. So I guess my concern with this is the system that's coming up is going to reduce funding to the educational system, because I don't see us actually adding $200 million to backfill the taxes that are available, especially for those that have been, you know, really contributing to education funding to the cap. They're the ones that would see the greatest reduction, because if you haven't been filling to the cap, then you still have room in there to contribute.
Representative, through the chair, nobody gets less funding. If you're going to the cap, your community is going to get the same amount of money. The question is, who's going to pitch in more? So no one through this bill gets less money. Okay, so I want to make sure that's clear. They may not get more money because they're already going to the cap, so there's not any additional funding. The legislature at any time can change the basic needs formula. If you don't think it works, you're more than welcome to change that. You know, but the legislature right now has this particular formula. They have determined, those who made the formula, that this is adequately funded. It has gone through at least one court case, could go through another one, and that could possibly be determined different. What the word adequate means, we hear that a lot of, what does that really mean? But at this point, all I can tell you is that there is a basic need formula that the state put together to determine what it takes to educate a child at a certain level. And then, of course, they've added to where voluntarily municipalities could get more up to a certain amount. Okay, so that's a fact. The other fact is that the Constitution says it's a responsibility of the state. Not a responsibility of the state when they have extra funding, not the responsibility of the state when they want to. It's a responsibility of the state because it was a promise to boroughs. Fairbanks, North Star Borough, they didn't want to be a borough. And if you ask most of them right now, they don't want to be a borough, but they are. And so part of that was, we're going to make sure that you get these services. And the state at one point said, well, guess what, guys? We don't have enough money. And so we're going to point to you because you're the easiest mark to fill that portion that we don't want to. And what is interesting to me is, as we've had extra revenue in oil, nobody bothered to go back and say, look at the detriment, because if I'm paying all this in property taxes in Fairbanks, it's not going to my economy. And now with the news yesterday that Flint Hills is closing, another hit to our community, we're still going to have to pay this. And we want to help our schools. And I think it's very exciting that without extra taxpayer money, if this goes through, our communities who aren't up to the cap actually gain from this, while the state fulfills what is their responsibility, not just when they have funding. I mean, to me, it's pretty cut and dry that Mandatory Borough Act was put in, and that was supposed to be fulfilled by the state. They determined they didn't have enough money, they were going to push it off on someone else, and we've allowed it to happen all these years.
Representative Ledoux.
I know one bill can't fix everything all at one time, but going back to the concept of who pays for the buildings and at what percentage, I guess it would seem to me that if you buy the argument that the state should be paying 100% for education, that it would seem to follow that there shouldn't be districts that have to pay 70 or 30% compared to others that need to pay 40% compared to others that need to pay 0. I mean, why wouldn't that follow also? Or maybe it does.
Representative Ledoux, through the chair. First of all, I am not an attorney, but I have read most of the court cases that have come through, and it is my understanding, and there might be a little help from behind me, I'm not sure, but there was some court cases on about bonding and about taking care of high schools and schools. You have the Casile case that came out that was settled. It didn't go through the whole point of it, and the state ended up building more schools. But for whatever reason, and it's probably because it's not a formula-based, where we've said this is basic needs to it, it goes through a different area. And so, from my understanding, the 70, 30, 60, 40, which could be changed. It used to be 90, 10. In fact, it was 100% at one time. Again, when the state didn't have money, guess what they did? They pushed it off on the municipalities. I know you're all, surprised. But court-wise, buildings have been taken that direction, and I don't think we won that one. But in a real world with a state that had a lot of money and could do that, absolutely. Or one that could afford that everybody, would be a borough. But that isn't the world that we live in, and so right now, for me, it's about this particular constitutional portion of it.
Thank you.
Do we have any other, Representative Peggy Wilson?
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I'm thinking that, okay, if this goes through, and if we would have to go ahead and 100% fund schools all the way, and the municipalities wouldn't at all, that would be wonderful, because that would give them more money. Okay. However, what that would do to our state budget would be that, one, there may be legislators that would say, well, we gave them local control, but they were doing something. They were donating something, but now we're given all the money, so why don't we have more say of how they teach? No, that's one thing that I'm thinking of. Another thing is I'm thinking, okay, the state has got this is the basket of money, and we're responsibility as our responsibility as legislators is to look overall what we're funding in the state, and so we might have to stop funding some other things, and which very well might happen. So if we have to stop funding other things, then that might mean that we're not funding some of the things and the municipalities will just have to pick it up in a different way. I'm just trying to think, there's always unintended consequences when we do things, and so I think we have to be very careful and think overall, what are the unintended consequences here? And we want to be smart in what we're doing and think ahead of what the possibilities, what could happen that we're not thinking about. And I'm concerned about some of those other things because we've got a few years here that we know that our revenues aren't going to be up there for a while. We know that right now. And so we have to plan for that. So we have to be responsible. And here we're looking at we kind of look at the policy. But overall, there's another committee that's going to be looking at the money side of it. And they may do some things totally different than what we're thinking. So I just think we have to be wise in what we do.
Through the chair, Representative Wilson. Very good points. But first of all, I found it interesting as I talked to people about this bill that they thought because they were giving something over $90 million, that gave them more local control. It doesn't give you any more local control. Those who only have impact aid going in has the same amount of control as municipalities does. And again, this has nothing to do with how much money the state has. It has to do with their responsibility. They set the rules, and then they reneged on the rules. And the municipalities are the ones who lost on that. Also, I want to remind the committee that the extra amount that is being given still can be given. Do you really? I don't believe that Fairbanks could say, oh great, they're going to give the $26 million and we don't have to, and we're not going to give that other $22 million. I would be very shocked that that would ever happen because, again, our community would say, no, we want to fund our schools to this portion of it. Yes, do we benefit because, we can't go, with that extra amount and can go back to the taxpayers? Absolutely, but that means they can fund them more. But to use the argument, first of all, that, we don't have the money, well, too bad. Then we should, the Constitution was written, a mandatory act. We made boroughs become boroughs, whether they wanted to or not, based on a promise we didn't keep. Will we have to take it out of somewhere else? Well, last I had heard, children are like our #1 priority in the state, unless that's changed in the last few minutes. So if some others don't get it, well, sometimes you just have to take on those responsibilities and figure a better way to do it. But again, this is about the Constitution and what we're required to do, not our pocketbooks. And so I appreciate what you're saying. And before I put this bill forward, I looked at all those things, and it kept coming back that the state made a promise that they didn't keep. And now we're saying the same thing, because when we had money, why didn't we go back and change it if it was about the money? When we were rolling in all the money and we were dishing it out here and out there that we should have maybe been saving more of it, we didn't address that then. But now all of a sudden we don't have the money, and too bad. Well, that just really, when it comes to the Constitution, doesn't work. But I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you. Representative Ledoux.
Is there anything that we can do about the cap? I mean, how do you get is the cap a federal thing that, basically mandates that one district can't give too much money because you want everybody on an equal playing field?
Through Chair Representative Ledoux, that is my understanding, is that before they had the cap, certain areas were able to give more money than others could even afford to do, and so that was set by the federal government.
So why don't they mandate that parents can't help their kids with homework, because some parents don't help their kids with homework? It just doesn't make any sense.
Representative Ledoux, through the chair, it sounds like a policy call.
Thank you. Do we have any further questions for the representative? Representative Peggy Wilson.
I just have to say that it doesn't make any difference what promises. We change our laws all the time from one thing to another. Since I've been here, we've changed a lot of the rules and regulations that in education, actually, and so I'm just saying that I still stand on what I'm talked about unintended consequences, because we will have unintended consequences, and it doesn't make any difference what we have to look at reality. So
one last thing, Representative Wilson, through the chair. Changing statute is something that we can do through policy.
Yeah.
That is absolutely different than this. To change the Constitution, I believe that there's a resolution about school choice. And if we could just go do whatever we wanted, we could have school choice without going through the resolution. Mm-hmm. But my understanding, and this is just my understanding, that the Constitution sits at a completely different standard than what we do for bills and laws. It has a process. So that's why I think this is at a different level, because this is about the Constitution. If we don't want this, if we don't want to take care of what we right now are mandated to do, then let's put it out to the voters and say, some of you should pay, some of you not so much. And I have a strange feeling that everybody would try to make this as equal to the original promise as they could. And sadly to say, yeah, we don't always hold to our promises, and that's wrong. And so I'm trying to correct one of those wrongs.
Thank you, Representative Wilson. And with that,